Good morning, DawgNation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It is very cold outside, but we're glad to have you with us and thankful to our friends at Merriweather and Tharp who make it all possible for you here today. A lot to do. Running a little late. That's on me. I apologize for that. So I'll say hello to a couple of you online here, then we'll get ready to get what I think is a really fun show started today. Jake Fromm going to join us here in a little bit. One of the things we promised was we would ask some of our guests sort of head on about, the sort of ongoing fan conversation as it relates to Mike Bobo and some of the coaching decisions that perhaps impacted what we saw from Georgia on the field. We'll let Jake talk more about that today. I think it's really good. Terrence Edwards not going to be able to be here today. Terrence is out working. Is it the All-American Bowl in San Antonio this week? I get a lot of these. The Navy All-American Bowl now, and that is where Terrence is this week. So Terrence not able to join us today. But nonetheless, Jake Fromm, really good conversation with Jake, kind enough to be a part of our program, despite the fact that he and his Detroit Lions teammates working very hard, trying to win a Super Bowl. So good stuff going there. Low Country Dog pointing out that I'm in my Arctic fan gear. Listen, I make no bones about this. My blood is built for like Royal Caribbean cruise vacations and not snow and ice. I'm always shocked that people would intentionally choose to live in places where weather like this happens fairly common. I do not like it. I am going to try to stay as warm as I can. Rough going here for sure. Yard Dog also pointing out single-digit wind, we call it wind chill. Yeah, it's rough. It's rough. Let's see what else. A lot of folks here at DawgNation.com having a good time. A Low Country Dog also taking some shots at Billy Napier. You always love that. UGA Marine sharing thoughts on tonight's game. I'm starting to get a little bit more interested in this. I mean, the thing I'm excited about is that, A, we may be kind of snowed in, and we are planning to do the show from home tomorrow morning just because of the anticipation of all this. And so you have, if you start tonight, semifinal games Thursday night, Friday night, you have what? Wild card games Saturday, Sunday, and into Monday. Am I right about this? You got 2 on Saturday, 3 on Sunday, 1 on Monday. Am I right about that? That's a lot of football, folks. Like, that's about as much like good, high-quality football on consecutive days we probably ever had. So from that standpoint, there's probably a lot to like. Now, Dennis B. does bring a good point. He says that you can always fix cold by layering up and adding more layers. When it's really, really hot, you can't necessarily do that. And that's true, but I like to stay as close as I can, like, say, a swimming pool or something like that. I'm still probably built for the warm weather more so than the hot weather. That is probably true. Let's see what else. Yeah, Matt Rugavina here having a good time. You always love that. Yes, a lot of folks in here in the DawgNation comment section having a good time here today. Thomas T-Bone 86, he's checking in here too. By the way, Senior Dog 54 pointing out that Brett Thorson coming back. Really funny announcement from him yesterday. We enjoyed that. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about who is coming and going. Get the Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins news yesterday. I think that is of note, so we'll give you that here too. A lot to discuss, in other words. So let me do this. Let me fire up the animation. We'll tell everybody about the show, and then we'll get ready to get going here on a frigid Thursday. We're glad you're with us. Good morning, DawgNation. And it is still a good morning, I reckon, although it is frigid cold. But either way, we're glad that you're with us for DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. We're going to do a lot on the show today. Jake Fromm stops by. That's going to be an interesting conversation because I promised all of you yesterday that I would ask him about the situation with Mike Bobo and the prevailing narrative among some fans and a good number of Georgia fans that something's perhaps wrong with Georgia's coaching situation, and that's maybe one of the reasons it's forced to watch these college football playoff semifinal games on TV tonight and tomorrow. So we told you we would ask some of our guys about that. We did that with Davin Bellamy yesterday. We'll do that with Jake Fromm here today. I will tell you that Terrence Edwards is not going to be able to join us. He is on assignment working out there at the Navy All-American Bowl in San Antonio. He's coaching out there, so we wish him well when he does that. But that'll be a really fun conversation with Jake Fromm. In addition to that, we're going to talk about the latest sort of player comings and goings for Georgia. including a player that's announced he's moving on to the NFL. And we'll talk about what that means for the Georgia defense in particular. We'll kind of get into that discussion here coming up in just a little bit. But off the top, there is a criticism that exists of Georgia right now that in a weird way actually makes me more optimistic for the season that we're about to have in 2025 and actually a little bit more comfortable about the scenario around Georgia. That may seem odd, but let me explain it as we get going here, and you'll decide for yourself if you agree. My name's Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at georgiadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I think sometimes my greatest strength is also my biggest weakness. Perhaps many of you are kind of the same way. This is perhaps true for me in both how I do the show and sort of also how I live my life. I am naturally kind of what you might call like a contrarian. I'm always really attracted to whatever the opposite sometimes of like what sort of mainstream opinion is. And there's like a way to like put this in like a really positive frame. Like, have you ever heard the line, I think it's attributed to Warren Buffett, the famous investor, that you want to be greedy when everybody else is panicked and panicked when everybody else is greedy. You know, there's a way to sort of frame that kind of contrarian style thinking in a very positive way, that it's a good way to sort of be smart. It's a good way to kind of, if you want to put it in that kind of context, make a lot of money in investing, because public is frequently wrong. So therefore, if you're the opposite direction of the public, you might have a chance to be right, and sometimes right in a very big way. So that's the sort of positive framing for that. But at the same time, I'll be the first to tell you, as someone who's like excessively contrarian and almost can't help but be, it's almost like I'm allergic to common opinion, whatever common opinion might be. There's also a way in which you're kind of almost sometimes in like a prison of your own making, because you just don't really trust anything and you sort of don't really believe anybody. And sometimes I sort of feel like I get kind of caught up in that sometimes. It's almost too contrarian for my own good, too going against the grain for my own good. I don't mind telling you that sometimes in life, I feel like that might be true for me. Now, let me explain to you why I'm saying that. Because as someone who is very, very contrarian, as someone who just has a very skeptical view of whatever the prevailing wisdom happens to be on almost any topic, I am taking a lot of comfort right now in some of the criticism that seems to exist about Georgia and the SEC more broadly, but specifically Georgia. I'm actually taking some comfort in that, because my assumption is, if everybody seems to think this, air quotes here, everybody is frequently wrong. So therefore, maybe Georgia's actually in pretty good shape for 2025 and perhaps moving forward. And we've told you in our theme on the show the last few days, kind of this week, since we've been back in Georgia after getting home from New Orleans and kind of shaking off the sort of worst of the doldrums of the loss to Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl, we have said that by and large, we're pretty optimistic about this upcoming season, and a little more optimistic about the state of Georgia football than perhaps we felt in the immediate aftermath of the game against the Fighting Irish while we were standing there on the turf of the Superdome. It's, you kind of pull back from that a little bit. You kind of see the kind of maneuverings we've seen since then, and I think there's still kind of a lot to like about Georgia. I like what Georgia's doing in the transfer portal, bringing in guys like Zachariah Branch and Noah Thomas as wide receivers. That, to me, seems to really help meet a need. But also, in addition to that, we can now kind of say this. The transfer portal from the departure standpoint is closed. Y'all, unless there's somebody whose paperwork kind of got, stuck between some couch cushions somewhere or something like that, the transfer portal, in terms of who you're losing off your roster, that's over with, at least for this cycle. And other than, with all due respect to the guys who did leave, other than like a Damon Wilson, for the most part, the sort of names that you heard were, for the most part, names you would have kind of expected. And some sort of mass exodus that would have induced a true panic from Georgia fans, that didn't really happen. So when you look at who Georgia's sort of adding in for the transfer portal, I would say the relatively small number of true impact names it's losing off the transfer portal. You're enduring, some of the stuff with the NFL, draft departures. But at the same time, there's also whispers and rumblings out there that scenario may be sort of more good than not for UGA. We are actually fairly optimistic right now about the outlook for Georgia here in 2025. Now, some of that's because we're just a little bit of an optimistic-minded, show. I'm an optimistic-minded person. I think life's pretty good, so therefore being happy about life to me is sort of my, default position for the most part. But I think there's also some evidence to suggest that, hey, just because Georgia lost a game that most of us were, pretty disappointed by, doesn't mean that things are over for UGA. And to kind of go back to the point that I was making to begin today, the fact that so many sort of national media voices, to my mind, who are wrong about almost everything, the fact that so many national media voices seem to be thinking the opposite of that, the contrarian-minded version of me, the version of me that takes a pretty a dim view of a lot of the prevailing wisdom found in the media, all of a sudden now the fact that these people don't seem to see all this makes me in a roundabout way a little even more excited about Georgia than I otherwise would be. So can we do this for a minute just for fun? Can we talk about some of what's being said after Georgia's loss to Notre Dame and kind of make a very small, simple point about why that's perhaps wrong? And maybe after the next couple of minutes here, you will join me in, if you're not already, being pretty optimistic about the outlook for Georgia here in 2025. Let me start with this. This is a guy that I think for the most part I kind of like, although he doesn't seem to like us very much sometimes. It is Joel Klatt, the Fox analyst. I think that Klatt is kind of a sober voice. I don't mean not drinking. I mean just someone who, he seems to like college football, seems to take it pretty seriously. He may take himself too seriously, but that is, I guess, an affliction that many could be accused of being guilty of. But otherwise, I think that Klatt is an okay guy, I reckon. Well, in his show the other day, in the aftermath of Georgia losing to Notre Dame, Klatt grabbing a hold of that, as many in his position seem to be doing, as evidence that things have really changed when it comes to college football, and things have changed for Georgia in particular. This is a dire warning to dog fans, Klatt would have you believe. Let me let you hear it, and we'll talk about why. I don't quite know if I'm buying all this right now. This is Joel Klatt.
Over the previous 10 years, what we have seen is teams like Georgia stockpile talent, in particular at the defensive line, and they were dominant at the line of scrimmage and on the offensive line. But now you can't stockpile talent. Because of the transfer portal, kids are not going to sit there and be backups at Georgia and Alabama if they can go play elsewhere. And so now talent is more dispersed around the country, and we are seeing that play out right in front of our eyes in this playoff.
So I think there's a lot that's very interesting about what Joel Klatt says there. And I think one of the things you can't help but notice is that Klatt credits the transfer portal for kind of helping balance the sport out and the sort of lawless NIL culture that kind of influenced a lot of these transfers. I've said before that if you assume that the people making decisions for college football are doing so because the sport is essentially run by a small collection of the sport's enemies, if you assume that's true, then you perhaps won't be completely wrong or thrown off guard by the way in which the sport is governed. That might actually make some sense. I think Klatt's words there perhaps kind of shed some more light on that, because all the craziness that we see taking place here, transfer culture, NIL culture, at least in terms of the way in which it's sort of not really governed or sanctioned or, essentially kind of lawless. We're not really against players getting paid. We are against the way in which the player payments create this sort of unmanaged chaos. We're sort of against that. But when you look around and say, how come nobody does anything about this? The sport seems to be getting more chaotic by the day, and people look around and say, well, how come no one's doing anything about this? I think Klatt's comments right there help explain why that is. It's because the purpose of a system is always what it does. And the college football system is making things more chaotic, and I would suggest that's by design. Because what you ultimately see is that all of a sudden, because of, and Klatt said this with his own words right there, because of the transfer portal and because of all the ways where that's being leveraged, All of a sudden now the kind of depth that a school like Georgia has been hoarding for such a long time, hoarding that depth is no longer as easy to do. So how come no one's doing anything about the chaos that currently exists in college football, the sort of chaos that's causing some coaches to retire and coaches that have the option to go to the NFL, or coaches who have the option to go back to high school, in some cases going back to high school? How come no one's doing anything about that? I would suggest because the system is working as it's designed to work. It's leveling the playing field. It's balancing things out. Make no mistake about this. And Kirk Herbstreit talked about this the other day. I was going to try to play the clip for you. And honestly, I couldn't find it. I don't know if it's, but Herbstreit said, listen, if college football is going to put its thumb on the scale of the sport to kind of create the perfect playoff, they wouldn't have 4 SEC teams. People accuse the ESPN of SEC bias all the time. They wouldn't have 4 SEC teams. What they would have is college football semifinals like they're going to have tonight and tomorrow, with a big Midwestern brand like Notre Dame, a team like Penn State, which is as close to the Northeast as we're ever going to get, a team from sort of the Western quadrant like Texas, and kind of Ohio State kind of thrown in there too. These 4 teams playing these 2 semifinal games the next 2 nights, it's going to be huge ratings. And you are getting rid of, as Herbstreit kind of alluded to in an interview with On3 the other day, the sort of small town southern teams that don't, have as big a national following as probably Ohio State and Notre Dame might do, at least in some cases, that this is kind of what college football wants. And the system that's in place now has, at least for now, kind of balanced out the playing field on all of this. And when you start to see that take place, you start to understand, oh, maybe this is what all this chaos was about. It's bringing about a version of the sport that's a little bit more palatable to the executives that run the sport. That's at least worth considering. Interesting stuff there from Joel Klatt. But as far as the doom and gloom goes for Georgia on all of this, I don't know if that's quite as true as he would suggest that it might be. And as a way of kind of making this point, let me let you hear another clip here from Klatt, because looking at what failed Georgia, but also kind of tying this into the rest of the SEC, what Klatt would have you believe is that what we've seen in this year's postseason, perhaps also coupled with last year's postseason, where an SEC team did not play for the national championship and Georgia did not make the college football playoff, that all of a sudden the last 24 months in the sport are proof that everything has changed for how teams like Georgia compete for championships and the talent edge that Georgia expects to have in those types of games. Once again, here is the Fox analyst Joel Klatt.
The narrative that the SEC is so clearly head and shoulders above everybody all the time is dead, and it needs to die based on the evidence in front of our eyes. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't have the most guys drafted in the NFL draft. It doesn't mean that they're not a great conference. They are a great conference. They're probably the deepest conference this year. There's no doubt. However, this idea of vast superiority needs to die based on the evidence, not narrative, evidence.
So that's Joel Klatt sort of saying this from sort of the broadcast perspective. There were plenty of sports writer types saying a thing similar to that. You know who? It's Nicole, I think it's Auerbach, is that how you say her name? I think she works now for NBC. She's worked, I guess, for other outlets prior to this, but sort of representing kind of the common opinion of many writers, also sort of echoed what Klatt said on his show. Can we show this from Nicole Auerbach, who says we no longer need to default to deference when it comes to the SEC based on decades of prior success. We can and should evaluate these teams as they are now, warts and all, just like everybody else in college football. Now, let me tell you for a moment why I actually take some comfort in what Nicole so-and-so says and what Joel Klatt says, even though they are critical of my favorite team and the league my favorite team plays in. Think about the logic they're trying to employ, including Nicole there a moment ago. She says, hey, the decades, those are her words, decades of SEC dominance no longer matter. What matters is what we've seen this year. Now think about it. Does that make sense to you? Something that was proven over the course of, to use her phrase, decades, can now be disproven in 1 year? And similar in the case of Joel Klatt. Let's keep this just to Georgia for a moment. Do you know that prior to losing to Notre Dame on January 2nd, Georgia had not lost a non-conference game in 6 years. 6 years. And ironically enough, the team that they got beat by was also in New Orleans. It's Texas, who's now in the SEC. But nonetheless, that was a non-conference game when Georgia played it. Georgia had not lost a non-conference game in 6 years. Now, while that dominance against non-SEC teams was taking place, was anybody giving Georgia credit for that? How frequently did you hear about that? This idea that not only is Georgia winning its non-conference games, but it's winning its non-conference games against highly ranked opponents. In other words, that stretch of time would have included one win per year against Georgia Tech, with the exception of 2020 when those two teams didn't play. But even if you take the Tech series out and Georgia's winning streak against Georgia Tech, even if you take the Tech series out, just look at the games that Georgia played against ranked non-conference foes. You know, you're talking about a top 10 Cincinnati team in the Peach Bowl in 2020. You're talking about a Michigan team in a playoff game in the Orange Bowl. That's a blowout win. You're talking about a Clemson team to begin the 2021 season that had been a fixture in the playoffs. You're talking about a 49-3 win over Oregon in the start of the 2022 season, a 65-7 over TCU in the national championship, largest bowl win, second only to that against Florida State in the Orange Bowl. It's not just wins against ranked opponents, but it's most of those in blowout fashion. That Georgia essentially had an average margin of victory over the course of that span by like 30 points against ranked non-conference opponents. But did Georgia ever get any credit for that? Were they ever even acknowledged for having that streak? You probably didn't even know it, or you might not know it, just given how little it was talked about outside of shows like this. So all of a sudden, I find it to be very interesting that whether it's be sports writers or TV analysts or whatever else, that they only seem to be willing to acknowledge Georgia's dominance against non-SEC teams now that they have reason to think it's perhaps over. I found that to be interesting. And, you know, pretty clearly we don't come from like an objective point of view here. We're a show that makes, no bones about. We are for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We talk about what Georgia fans are talking about. So pretty clearly we have a point of view that we do this show from. I would suggest that perhaps some outside the boundaries of Dog Nation perhaps have their own not quite so objective point of view here too. It almost sounds like a little bit of wishful thinking, that the era of dominance is definitely over and this one game proves it, and yet somehow 6 years worth of wins against non-conference foes didn't prove anything, but this one loss proves everything. Think for a moment about how illogical that is. Now, let me wrap all this up by saying this. There is a very good chance that we'll look back on that game against Notre Dame and say, boy, that was a signal of more to come. And no doubt, Georgia has slipped a little bit off the championship perch that it had been on. This team this year, I think, to our eyes, was not as good as those two teams in 2021 and 2022 were. I don't think anybody can dispute that. We would agree with that. But we would say that those who try to use that as evidence to make the leap, that the great run that Georgia's been on is now over, and one game against Notre Dame proves that, despite the fact that the long track record of big wins that Georgia compiled in kind of convincing fashion against non-conference foes, that didn't seem to prove anything because it was certainly not hailed as evidence to include Georgia in the 2023 playoff. People act like that hadn't happened when Georgia was being evaluated for that playoff. But all of a sudden now this loss to Notre Dame seemingly proves everything. This, to me, is why sometimes the contrarian opinion is sort of the right side to be on here, because conventional wisdom has a tendency to become a little bit of an echo chamber. And you don't have to look very far in the media right now to hear the echoes of, Georgia lost to Notre Dame. Georgia didn't used to lose these non-conference games to teams like Notre Dame. There used to be a big talent edge here, and now that Georgia slipped, it's now over forever. Be careful about words like that. Forever or always or never, those sort of very absolute-sounding words. All we know is that for this year, UGA has to live with a little bit of disappointment. But given the long-standing track record for the Dogs, proven over the course of years, the idea that what happened to conclude the 2024 season is going to become what defines Georgia moving forward, history would suggest that might not be true. And while there's a little bit of short-term pessimism about these Dogs right now, I think over the course of the long haul, there could still be plenty of reasons for optimism among Georgia fans. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. We're happy you're with us, no matter how you get to us. Video, 10 a.m., radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, Apple, Spotify, everything else. We're just really happy to have you as a part of the program, and we really thank our friends at Merriweather and Tharp who make it all possible. You know, we said this yesterday. We're talking about one of our great sponsors, about how proud we are of sponsors to our show who are just big supporters of UGA. I can promise you this. Our friends at Merriweather and Tharp are as deeply tied into Georgia football and Georgia athletics as anybody's ever going to be. Bob Tharp, his wife Ashley, they're going to games all the time. I see them on road games, see them at home games. They're always around, always having fun, a big part of our DawgNation invasions and things like that. They are just deeply entrenched in wherever the dogs are. And I love having sponsors who love supporting UGA. It makes me very proud. I'm also thankful for Merriweather and Tharp because of the way in which they serve our audience in a time of need. If I had my way, and I've said this 1,000 times, if I had my way, every single one of you would have an unbelievably happy marriage, and you would never even have to consider divorce. If I had my way, that would be my wish for all of you. But here's what we know. Life, reality requires you to play the ball where it lies. And for the audience the size of ours, statistically speaking, some of you, a lot of you perhaps, maybe even right now, are confronting the notion that divorce may be an unavoidable possibility for you in your life. That just may be what's going on for you. And if that's your case, I am sorry. What I can tell you is, while I might not have the power to make that go away and disappear, one thing I can do is to set you up to have a conversation with someone about how you can have more success, more happiness, more enjoyment in the next season of your life. And that's what our friends at Merriweather and Tharp are all about. They are your source for Georgia divorce. This is now true statewide, not just in Atlanta, where they've been known for a long time, but Carrollton, Athens, Peachtree City, Savannah, all across the state, offices opening up all the time to kind of provide the same level of service to Georgians, no matter where you are, that they've been kind of well known for here in the Atlanta area for a very long time. So if this is one of those things that you know you will be talking about here in 2025, whether you want to or not, it's just going to happen. Then talk about what you can do to protect yourself the best, your finances, your relationship with your children, all the things that matter with all of this. Have a conversation about with Merriweather and Tharp about what you should do next, what needs to happen next, and let them walk you through all of that. You can find them online. It's GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. That's their website, GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. Merriweather and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. Make sure you check them out if you need them here today. All right, we are going to talk to Jake Fromm here coming up in a moment. Now, I told you, a hot topic amongst Georgia fans, because I just had this whole discussion a moment ago about why I'm optimistic and why I think some of the critics may be wrong. The one thing that, within the confines and the boundaries of DawgNation, the sort of happy little world in which we live in, even within the sort of the confines of DawgNation, you do see some skepticism right now. A lot of folks are not happy with the state of the Georgia offense. And a very hot topic, whether it be our comment sections live on video or social media or wherever else Georgia fans gather, a very hot topic remains the offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo. We are a show that wants to reflect fan conversation. And what we've said is, hey, we bring on some of our former players, like at Davin Bellamy yesterday, at Jake Fromm today. We were hoping to have Terrence Edwards on. Terrence is kind of on assignment this week. He's coaching this week at the Navy All-American Bowl, so good for him on that. But when we bring these former players on, we said, we're going to ask them. Well, we'll let them tell us their feelings about Mike Bobo, and from a more expert point of view than I can certainly share as not being a former player. What do you think? What's your evaluation of that? And we're going to do that with Jake Fromm coming up in a moment. I know we are because we recorded this yesterday. Jake, very busy right now as his Detroit Lions are making a run through the playoffs and getting a chance to be the NFC's #1 seed. So Jake joined us yesterday afternoon. We recorded it to air today. You'll get a chance to hear that coming up in a moment, and we'll do the Mike Bobo topic head on with Jake before that discussion is done. But prior to that, let me go around the doghouse here for a moment. And once again, to kind of, I guess, add some additional context to what I said to start the show, which is, unlike many in the national media, I'm actually pretty optimistic about Georgia for the upcoming season. Can't guarantee anything, but certainly don't see evidence of an empire in decline, of a program that's no longer going to be competitive. They may not win the SEC again. They may not be back in the playoff again. anything is a possibility given the current landscape in college football. But this idea that Georgia's going to voluntarily exit the national stage just because they lost a disappointing game to Notre Dame, the sort of team that had not really beaten them in the past, I don't necessarily think that's the case. But that does not mean there isn't reason for concern. And we're going to try to be as fair and balanced as we can be while we talk about the good things going on with Georgia. We will also talk about some of the areas in which I think there is still some concern about UGA. Let me give you an example of that here right now. Once again, not sky falling necessarily or anything too dire, but I do think you are starting to see take shape what will be one of the very big questions for Georgia as you go into spring practice. Yesterday, amongst a flurry of news, one of the things we saw from Georgia is one of the NFL draft declarations was Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins. He played the defensive end position for UGA. I think this year he played at a really high level. I had some hope that TID might come back for 2025. Ultimately, though, that didn't happen, and maybe part of the reason that didn't happen is because the way in which he played this year kind of gets him on the radar for NFL scouts. Now he'll have a chance to go on and make himself a lot of money in the professional ranks. We certainly wish him well as he does that. But I do think that this sort of reflects one of those losses for UGA. It's maybe a little bit more meaningful than perhaps it seems at first blush. I think that Ingram-Dawkins gave Georgia a lot this year. And in fact, I'm reminded of something that Kirby Smart said going back a little earlier in the fall about a guy who's battled injury and perhaps at the beginning of his Georgia career was not playing as much as he would have liked to, that he is kind of the perfect example of, hey, if you're patient and you kind of bide your time, eventually at a place like Georgia, the notion of kind of work while you wait, that can kind of pay off. Tyrion, the first name's always hard for me to say, Ingram-Dawkins, for whatever reason, that's my own issue. But Ingram-Dawkins seemed to be a really good example of that. This is what Kirby said about that and the message that TID had sent to his teammates along those lines earlier this year. This is Kirby Smart.
And you said besides health, his work ethic, I mean, he's always been a pretty good football player. He's a great kid. He's been in the dumps because of his foot. And so you'd see him every day and he had no smile on his face. He's got a beautiful, great mom, and she's been in great communication with us. You know, he had considered the portal at one time and he talked about his frustrations, but it was really more out of injury than it was anything else. And I remind him every day that he's out there working because sometimes he needs a little motivation to work. And I'm like, you could be over there riding that bike. You could be over there, you know, lifting and not practicing. And he gets a little more juice and practices a little harder. And he's sometimes woe is me, but he's a great kid. And I enjoy coaching him. And he's played really good football this year, I think, because he had a great camp. And he had really good camp practices, and it's helped him to play better.
This is separate from the point we're currently making, but I always think it's really funny. There's like two completely different versions of Kirby Smart during his press conferences. There's the Kirby Smart press conference version where he doesn't want to say anything and he wants it over as quickly as he can, and he's just giving you the shortest, most like sort of meaningless answers possible as a way of just running out the clock and getting out of there, and sometimes that's what you get. But also sometimes you get that version of Kirby Smart where he's like being the most honest that anyone's ever been about anything and like really just sort of telling you this is what it is, this is what it's like. Like, you know, you don't get that all the time, and perhaps no one's that candid, you know, constantly. But it's really cool when Kirby sometimes is like, hey, I'm about to tell you the truth, and it's about to sound different. And, you know, like it's just really interesting sometimes when Kirby like really lays it out in a very truthful way. And that evaluation of Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins was, I think, really, really truthful right there. And I do think it's a really good football story to see what he battled through to become the player that he became here this year. And because of that, you know, you always hate to see, at least the selfish part of you anyway, always hates to see a productive player go. And so a little bit of, you know, bittersweet about seeing a guy like this who perhaps could have come back, choose to move on, although we certainly, no doubt about it, wish him well as he goes to the NFL. But the other point that comes up for me about this is, I think when you look at Georgia for the upcoming season, there's going to be a little bit of energy around the sort of outside edge of the defense. You know, Damon Wilson is exiting via the transfer portal, we believe. His name is certainly in. We think he's probably gone. You know, defensive end like Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins is also moving on too. And, you know, kind of what Georgia does on the outside edge of its defense is going to now become pretty important. And if I try to be for a moment as candid and as honest as Kirby Smart just was in that clip we heard, what I will tell you is I think one of the disappointments I've sort of had since 2021 is that the position that TID plays, the defensive end spot, that hasn't become more of like a true destination position at Georgia the way that you think it would have after Trayvon Walker used that position to become the number 1 overall pick in the 2022 NFL draft. Like, think for a moment about how Georgia is at inside linebacker. You know, it kind of starts with Roquan Smith, who wins the Buckus Award, gets drafted very high, has gotten a free agent contract since then and got paid, big stats when he surpassed 1,000 career tackles this past weekend. Like, Roquan Smith sort of started a chain reaction at Georgia that kind of continues to this day because Roquan was the first to do it, and then Nakobe Dean became like the first of those next Roquan Smiths to kind of really live into that, and he had obviously a great college career, and we believe that he's on his way to big things in the NFL. And then you've got this entire pipeline of very similar recruits who've come to Georgia since then, that the success that Roquan Smith started has kind of created this sort of snowball that I think you still see evidence of that kind of living on at Georgia today. And you sort of hope that all the positions where Georgia has that kind of breakout star, you sort of hope all the positions might have the same, I guess, impact. But it sort of seems like that the 3-4 defensive end, the sort of position that Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins plays, is still a little bit of a, at times, if we're being honest, a hard sell for recruits, for young football players that have options, a little bit of a hard sell, no matter how successful Trayvon Walker came while playing that position. And this is the thing that Kirby Smart's been, once again, very candid about in the past, too. You know, the notion that people are going to kind of rag on Georgia, negative recruit against Georgia, whether it be the edge rusher spot that Damon Wilson played or the spot now left open because of Ingram-Dawkins' departure or whatever else, that if you want to come to Georgia and want to be a part of that, you better be careful, opposing coaches would say, ne'er-do-wells that they are. You better be careful because you're not going to get stats, you're not going to get glory, you're not going to get individual attention. And Kirby Smart has said that they've had to try to fight that off in the past. Smart has also said because of the success they've had, they've been pretty good at winning those battles. Let's go back and hear him from last September discussing that.
Well, we usually fix that when we show them how many we have drafted and that it's silenced, because we put Trevon Sachs up there and say he went number 1 overall. We put Devontae's up there and say he went in the first round. We put Quay's up there. We put Nolan's up there. We put Jordan Davis's, and then they don't say anything.
So, I mean, listen, you love the mic drop moment from Kirby Smart right there. Honesty compels me to admit, though, I sort of wish that was as true as Smart's emphatic statement seems to lead to believe that it is that we're led to believe that Wilson is leaving in part because he did want those stats. And even if you do come to Georgia and you do get paid in the NFL, or even you get paid well while you're here, there is still the sort of individual glory that, you know, some players seem to want. And the sort of edge rusher, defensive end type guy, those are the sort of the positions that at least the negative recruiters would say that you do have a chance at sort of better stats and more individual attention playing elsewhere than you do here. Georgia, as Kirby would say, hey, we got the Trayvon Walkers we can sell, or, you know, different position with the interior defensive linemen who've become first-round picks we can sell. We can sell a lot of stuff, but that's sort of the interesting battle, you know, that's going to go on as you get ready for 2025. And keep in mind, spring practice is going to be here before you know it. The interesting battle of, you know, how does Georgia find that new defensive end? How does Georgia find that new outside linebacker? And guys like, say, Isaiah Gibson or perhaps Gabe Harris that could be almost a little bit of a fit at either spot. You know, where do they gravitate towards, and what does that mean for the spot that they're not in? That's going to be a big topic here for the spring. So bottom line is, overall, we are very optimistic about the current state of Georgia football, but that doesn't mean there aren't some really big questions around UGA. One of those we just touched on. What happens on kind of the edge of the Georgia defense? Defensive end, outside linebacker. As you get a little closer to spring, that is one of those things we will be watching for very, very closely. And by the way, we can't wait for spring to be here because it is very cold right now. That's also around the doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Now, we've lost all sense of time around here. We're as late as we've ever been. But before I get to Jake Fromm and talk about everything going on with Jake and what's going on with Georgia from Jake's perspective, let me also remind you that if you want to stay up to date on everything that you can get from the Georgia Bulldogs from DawgNation.com, our great coverage. Great way to do that is to sign up for our brand new Dog Nation newsletter. We're calling this our Hunker Download. If you go to DawgNation.com/newsletter, you can sign up. You can be right there. You can take advantage of that and get the best of Georgia coverage delivered right there to your inbox. In fact, I'm writing a little bit for this right there at the top of the page every single day. I'm very proud to be a part of that. That's a lot of fun for me. So you want like fun trivia, you want really good news, the latest breaking information, all of that coming your way via our Dog Nation newsletter. We're calling it the Hunker Download. You can find it online. Sign up for it. It comes right there to your email inbox, but you can sign up for it online at DawgNation.com/newsletter. Check that out for more today. Okay, so for now, on everything going on around Georgia, from a guy who's kind of been there before, the evaluation of Gunner Stockton's first start, some pretty candid thoughts on kind of Mike Bobo, what that looks like for the Georgia offense, and everything else. Let's get into it right now with a Kroger Fresh Take as we bring on Jake Fromm here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And here on DawgNation Daily, time now for a Kroger Fresh Take is welcoming the former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm to the program here, fresh off the organization he's a part of, the Detroit Lions. You see him wearing the Aloha blue hat there. What a win on Sunday night against the Minnesota Vikings. Arguably, and Jake, I don't know if you know this, the biggest regular season finale in NFL history. I don't think we've ever had two lost teams meet to conclude the regular season before. You guys get the win. You secure the 1 seed. Minnesota knocked all the way down to the 5 seed, so a really high-stakes game. This is really fun, and, boy, I imagine the folks up there in the state of Michigan have got to be just transfixed by all of this.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. A huge win for the organization. Like you said, I think how big this game was huge. I think the most combined wins by any teams ever meeting up, and I think the first time the number 1 seed mattered on the last week of the season since 1993. I mean, there was just a lot going on in this game. Man, really thankful to come up with a win. That number 1 seed is huge, and yeah, as Minnesota right now, we're getting better this week and trying to enjoy a little bit of break. We hadn't had a bye week since week 5 of the season, so this was well deserved and earned and well needed as well.
So along those lines, this is an issue that's existed in the NFL for a long time of, okay, well, if you win the division, or it used to be that way, now it's only 1 bye, but if you play well enough, you get the extra week, but then you have to worry about the old idea of rest versus rust. And I'm sure we talked about this leading into the Georgia game, but as it turns out, Georgia did wait a long time to play its game against Notre Dame. In fact, it even had to wait longer than it would have anticipated. And lo and behold, all 4 of the quarterfinal bye teams all lost in their first playoff game. I don't necessarily attribute Georgia's performance to the layoff. I think it's more about other issues. But hard not to notice that all 4 of those teams did lose. What do you make of that? Your team, as you said, just kind of earned its way into a little postseason rest, but Georgia didn't exactly maybe make the best use of its postseason rest because the season ended sooner than it would have liked for it to. What do you make of the fact that all 4 of those quarterfinal teams that had byes all lost?
Yeah, it's a great topic for discussion. The way I look at it, let's take Georgia Notre Dame, for example. Like you said, I don't attribute the time period of having to wait to play that game is the reason Georgia lost that football game. They outgained Notre Dame. They played very, very well on defense. They just didn't do the little things it took to beat a good football team. You take Oregon and Ohio State, for example. Well, I mean, Ohio State, they got hot. They were not the hottest team in college football, but they were able to get hot by playing Tennessee and demolishing a Tennessee football team. So that's just – it really kind of sucks to be Oregon, and it's bad luck of the draw for them. But that's a team they played in the regular season. It's tough to beat a good team twice. That one I kind of throw up as a toss-up. And then you take the other 2 games, for example, Boise State and Penn State. I think Penn State is just a better football team. And then you take Texas and Arizona State. I think Texas is just a better football team. Yeah. Now, that game got very hairy there at the end. But Texas got off to a commanding lead there at halftime and let Arizona State get back in that game. So I'm not a guy who believes in coincidences, but I don't think there's really anything here other than just the right football teams won during the week.
You played Notre Dame twice. Georgia won both times. Both games were close, but you know how it is for Georgia fans, Jake. The assumption always was that Georgia had the better athletes, the better players. Even in 2017, coming off what only been like an 8-win season the year before, I think Georgia fans still thought going into South Bend the better brand of athlete played for Georgia. Well, in the Sugar Bowl, I mean, at least based on just that game, the athletic edge that you're used to seeing Georgia have, I don't know that was apparent during the Sugar Bowl. Frankly, Notre Dame's athletes looked pretty good to me. They made, good tackles, obviously loved the running backs really good. They seem to have a little bit of athletic spark, I'm just being honest, that I don't know that I've seen from Notre Dame in the past. Is that because the non-SEC teams are getting better, or is that attributable to teams like Georgia perhaps not being as talented as they once were? If what I'm describing is true, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think this has to do with depth and NIL. They're all kind of indirectly correlating here. So instead of a young player going and going to a Georgia and Alabama and LSU, instead of being a backup and getting better at one of those programs, they're saying, hey, why would I go and be a backup somewhere when I can go up north and be a starter from day one and get paid in doing so? So right now you got guys who are going up north, Notre Dame, and these Big Ten schools, and they are getting developed and paid on playing time. So, that's exactly what you're seeing. Man, Notre Dame was a good football team, man.
Yeah.
They got players. They were coached very well, and they played they did the right things. They did the little things it took to beat a good football team, and they played better on that day.
How did you think Gunner Stockton did in his debut?
Man, I loved Gunner's debut because there was no fear in his eyes at all. Man, he didn't blink. He came out ripping the football, and even when they got down, there's a quick jump. All of a sudden, they're in this football game, and now they're down by 2 touchdowns. Man, he didn't blink. He just kept it ripping. Man, I loved kind of what he was doing and how he was playing. You could see in his body language, man, that he's a competitive football player, competitive dude. Man, I'm excited about the future of Georgia football with Gunner at the helm.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. It's clearly a building block for him because as just someone who tries to watch the sport closely, not a former player, but just someone who tries to watch it closely, looking for evidence that he was overwhelmed by the moment, this is his first start or anything like that. The best that I could tell, you didn't get any of that. He just seemed to be pretty comfortable. And if that's where his career begins, in a playoff game, in unusual circumstances, well, imagine how much easier it could get going forward. I guess, though, as a follow-up, I would ask, are you surprised that he didn't run it more, either through a design run or something like that? I think that's something that some fans thought they might see more of. We didn't see a ton of that. I believe it was just 6 carries on the day. Maybe we were wrong for assuming that, but are you surprised that Stockton did not run it more?
Yeah, kind of a little bit of yes and a no. Like I think Gunner is a very, very good and talented athlete. But I don't think Gunner is by any means Lamar Jackson, and giving Lamar Jackson 8 to 12 carries a game. I think Gunner is very good with his legs. But man, when you're playing good and high caliber football teams, man, speed matters, and those running lanes really collapse very, very quickly. So I think Gunner's a lot better with his arm than he is with his legs, and I think he'll have a longer career, quite frankly, if he kind of uses his arm more than his legs. But don't get me wrong, in this game of college football, the way it is today, having a guy who can do both at the quarterback position is huge.
Yeah.
And I think Georgia's offense will benefit from that moving forward next year.
I've got a final topic I want to address with you here in a moment. Let me remind folks before we do, though, this is our Kroger Fresh Take with Jake Fromm. Obviously, we've kind of reached that time in which a lot of folks are going to get stocked up. And I'm not being funny here. I'm being serious. Like the eggs, the bread, all that kind of stuff. It may snow this weekend, and I know how much so many of us throughout our lives have gone to get stocked up at the grocery store when that's going to be the case. Well, Kroger's going to be ready for you this week if you need to make sure you're well supplied for what might be a long winter hibernation here coming up in a couple of days. And right now, you can also try Kroger Boost for free for 30 days. That's a cool option to take advantage of twice the fuel points. You're saving money up to $1,000 on the stuff you're already buying at your local Kroger anyway. And you can also get free grocery delivery, free pickup, a lot of convenient options for you as a member of Kroger Boost. So check it out today. Kroger.com/boost for more on that. It is Kroger.com/boost for more on that. All right, Jake, final thing. And I actually promised our audience the other day that we would do this, you and some of the former players that join our show. I wanted to get a perspective from you on what's been the hottest topic. And you know how this goes. Georgia fans, man, and I'm one of them too, we're so passionate about the topic. We're so immersed into everything. That means the highest moments are really high. Sometimes the lowest moments are kind of low. And there's always going to be hot topics. And right now, the hot topic is the Georgia offense. And admittedly, I would say that for the season overall, that side of the ball probably didn't meet expectations. And for some people, they kind of want to put the finger of blame on that with the offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo. It's a familiar topic for many. So as someone who kind of knows offensive football far better than I do because of the role that you played as a quarterback and, even in the Kirby Smart era, what do you think of Mike Bobo as an offensive coordinator?
Yeah, I really like Coach Bobo. Love his dad. I think Coach Bobo is a great offensive coordinator. I think the toughest thing for him being put in this position is he is compared to Todd Monken, the offensive coordinator. Man, and I think Coach Monken is a brilliant offensive coordinator, a fantastic play caller. Not only did he do it at UGA, but he's doing it right now at the NFL for the Ravens, and the offensive stats that they're putting up are unbelievable. So it's really tough for Coach Bobo because he's getting compared to Coach Monken, who's coming off a great kind of college career there at UGA, and he's doing it again there in the NFL. But man, I really do. I like Coach Bobo. I think they have the right pieces there. And I think if they could just get the little things, they're so close. They were so close to being a very explosive offense. A few drops here, get a little bit better in the run game. I think they're onto something. And man, I really do. I'm a believer, and I think they're very, very close to kind of getting where they want to be on offense.
So just a simple follow-up then, what do you think the biggest missing piece for this offense is right now?
Yeah, I think you got to go find a go-to guy at receiver, a guy who's going to get you out of jail. Look, it's going to be tough to find a Brock Bowers. It's going to be tough to find a Ladd McConkey. But Ladd McConkey has been, the security blanket on third down, and Brock has been that explosive guy that you could always count on. You got to find somebody like that to make your offense more explosive. And I think, too, with the offensive line, I think it kind of comes into kind of a mental state, kind of to have this tenacity and have this physicality of, hey, we are going to run the football, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. So I think that's kind of like a mental programming they have to get done in the offseason and during training camp to be able to get that done in the fall.
Jake, great stuff. I tell you, I appreciate your perspective so much. You obviously know it so well, and we're obviously rooting for you and your Detroit Lions teammates to have a great run through the playoffs here. So best of luck with that, and we'll look forward to talking to you as a part of a Kroger Fresh Take here on DawgNation Daily very soon, too.
Thank you, Brandon. Stay warm this weekend.
We'll do our best.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
I got a very interesting comment. We can bring the music down just a little bit if you don't mind. A very interesting comment to YouTube while the Jake Fromm interview was playing. And as we said, we recorded that with Jake yesterday. JCP writes into YouTube to say, none of these people, he means the former players, are going to criticize Bobo in any way. BA is just manufacturing consent. I think that's a very funny sort of assessment of all of that. But to respond to that seriously here for a moment, in the case of Jake Fromm, that's a guy that's pretty close to all of this, but he's also not currently employed by Georgia. Now, he may be friends with Gunner, or he may, have relationship with the program still, or whatever else. He may have some of that, that's going on. I honestly don't know the degree to which that's going on, but some of that may be going on. But it's still kind of an independent outside voice. But we also had Davin Bellamy on the show yesterday, and Davin's a defensive guy. And, Davin, perhaps not quite as tied into some of those, sort of the offensive stuff. He's more of a defensive guy. Davin's also a guy that kind of shoots from the hip a little bit, too. I mean, there are plenty of examples where Davin kind of calls it like it is, and he was pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? He certainly wasn't too harsh with his evaluation of Mike Bobo either. So, like, I don't have an agenda here. Like, I'm not Mike Bobo's attorney or his agent or anything like that. And I told you that tomorrow we're going to do a much larger Mike Bobo topic. We are going to do sort of a bigger thing there on that. The only bias I have is this. Because ultimately, I want what's best for Georgia, whether that's the current state or an improved state or, a return to a previous state, whatever it is, I want the best for Georgia. So my only, I guess, bias in this discussion is right now, I think things, and I mean things broadly with the entire program, things are more good than bad. I do. This was not a perfect year for Georgia. I can't stand losing to teams like Notre Dame. Drives me crazy because of all the permission structure that creates for the national media types like we played off the top of the show. I cannot stand giving those people a peg to do what they're going to do. I'd just be totally honest about it. But even at the same time, Georgia won the SEC this year. A team like Texas that might win the national title, Georgia beat them twice. So while things are not perfect at UGA, and while, I do get aggravated by a loss like the one in Notre Dame, things are still more good than not. And that's really the only bias I have in this discussion. So my bias is not necessarily a pro-Bobo bias, if I do have one. My bias is I feel like we still have some space to be happy about what's going on with Georgia football, even if there are some things we wish were a little bit different. But now I'll also tell you this, in looking ahead to tomorrow's show, some of you have been weighing into me on the X platform. I guess that's probably the most common place I see this kind of thing. And you are kind of giving me your perspective on Mike Bobo and what you think, for those of you who are kind of in the anti-Bobo category, what you think is sort of wrong about the Georgia offense right now. So if you feel like our former players like Davin and Jake, if Terrence had been here today, we would have asked him about it. Terrence would be very pro-Bobo, though, because I've talked to him enough about that in the past to know. If you think all of those former players are too close to the situation to be as candid as you think they should be, or perhaps to mirror the opinion you think is more correct, you can send me your stuff. I'm going to try to use some of it on the show tomorrow. I told you, I am going to try to, in the discussion about Mike Bobo, I am going to try to offer the strongest argument against him I possibly can to reflect the feeling of the thousands of Georgia fans that seem to feel this way. And I'm always sort of fascinated about the way in which sometimes what you think of kind of like rank and file fandom, just sort of the average Georgia fan, how that opinion sometimes can be so different from the opinions of people who are a little closer to the situation. And if we're being honest here, both sides have a tendency to sort of look down on the others. For instance, commenter a moment ago said, these guys aren't going to tell the truth. They're too close to the situation. The flip side of that is sometimes the people really close to the situation will say, these fans don't know what they're talking about. None of them know football. Whatever sort of group you're in, the sort of, kind of like ivory tower, close to the situation types, or the sort of run-of-the-mill rank-and-file fan type, both groups sort of at times kind of look down on the other and sort of assume that the point of view they have kind of comes from some sort of, preconceived notion that's incorrect or something like that. So, I find the conversation sort of fascinating. And I am admittedly a little more pro-Bobo than some of you are, but that doesn't mean that I can guarantee anything about what he's going to do moving forward. So, yeah, I think that's it. We've also, we're talking about we're just blowing past all of our benchmark time-wise and things like that. We're going to get the train on the tracks here for a moment. So let me do this. Let's remind you, we're going to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. We got a great Royal Caribbean cruise coming up in April. I'd give anything to be on it right now. Utopia of the Seas, somewhere out in the Caribbean where it's warm. I cannot stand cold weather. I want to be as far from it as I can. And so if I'm walking through the Royal Promenade right now, one of these beautiful Royal Caribbean cruise ships, or taking advantage of the really cool new bar concepts and lounge concepts like the Pesky Parrot, where, you kind of have like the tropical theme in there, and you're kind of, right there just enjoying all that. Many of you like sort of the tropical themed cocktails, the pina coladas and all those really cool mixed drinks. well, you got a chance to do that, or up on the pool deck like the Lime and Coconut. So many great ways to have a great time on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. So if you've heard me talk about this, but you've never been on one, or maybe you're ready to go on one again, our friend Jessica Slater, a wonderful travel agent, can help you plan that Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. We'll see you in April for the DawgNation cruise, or really any time you can't get on board, a great chance to be on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation here right now. Jessica Slater, a wonderful travel agent that can help you do all of that. So let's do this here for a moment. The college football playoff semifinals begin tonight. You got Notre Dame, Penn State tonight. You got Texas and Ohio State tomorrow from what's going to be a really frigid Dallas. So that's going to be a little bit of a mess there. So we'll see how that impacts the crowd in the stadium. I don't think there's going to be any postponement or anything like that. But I do think, especially if you're a Texas fan that lives 2 hours from Dallas and you're planning on driving into the Metroplex for the game, that may get to be a little tricky if the roads are bad, because I'm guessing the Texans aren't any better driving on ice than we are. So that could be a little bit tricky. But nonetheless, you got that game tomorrow. You got Notre Dame, Penn State tonight. And before all of this happened with Georgia losing to Notre Dame, we were actually pretty complimentary of Notre Dame. You'll remember that we were not a part of the throng of people kind of disregarding Notre Dame and saying this is the same Irish team it always is. We weren't really doing that. We said going into the playoff that, as a comparison, we thought that Notre Dame was better than Penn State. I think that's still probably true as they get ready to play here tonight. I think one of the reasons why that's probably true is I think that Riley Leonard, although he's not an accomplished thrower, he threw for less than 100 yards against Georgia. I think that Riley Leonard is probably a quarterback I trust in sort of a big game spot a little bit more than I trust Drew Allar for Penn State. I think if it comes down to a battle like that, I think the presence of a guy like Leonard probably means a little more for the Irish than Allar does for Penn State. And for me, a lot of that for Leonard even goes back to his time at Duke. I've said before, you go back to the beginning of the 2023 season, the blowout win, at least very convincing win that Clemson, that Duke had against Clemson. Leonard was great in that game. He really was. And if he gets put in a position where he has to throw tonight, that's obviously maybe a little tricky for him, but maybe he doesn't get put in that spot. Or maybe he does also kind of come up big there. I mean, I remain a little bit skeptical of Penn State. We were all in New Orleans together watching the quarterfinal game, the Fiesta Bowl for Penn State against Boise State. And while, Penn State ultimately won that game, somewhat convincingly, I guess, and they ultimately did cover the spread, which for many of you is all what matters anyway. The truth is I don't know that I ever really thought that Penn State really grabbed that game by the throat. The whole notion of like game control. I don't know how much game control I thought that Penn State had against Boise State. So if you're saying of the two quarterfinal wins, which was more impressive, what Notre Dame did against Georgia, what Penn State did against Boise State, I don't think there's any doubt the Irish win against Georgia was far more impressive. And I would say that over the course of the season, Notre Dame was the more impressive of the two teams, too. So for me, it's Notre Dame tonight. And I guess one of the things that we'll also be watching pretty closely from this game is, does the winner of this game have the look of the kind of team, and if I'm right, it'll be Notre Dame, but does the winner of this game have the look of the kind of team that could also potentially win the national championship? Because this also almost kind of reminds you one of those years where, like, going back, and this is almost before my time, but remember like the 83 Final Four, and it's like, you got like, NC State and whoever, Georgia, I guess would have been on the one side, and you had like, the two big teams on the other side, where sometimes it sort of feels like the one game is just far bigger than the other. It sort of feels like the Texas-Ohio State game is just magnitudes larger than Notre Dame-Penn State. But I do think, especially if Notre Dame were to win, you'll be looking at the Irish from that vantage point of, is this a team that could also win the national championship game? And we'll talk more about Texas and Ohio State tomorrow. But as someone who bought very low on Ohio State in well before the market came, behind us on the Buckeyes. We predicted before the playoff began they would play for the national championship. We thought they would play Georgia. That's obviously not true, but we were right about Ohio State. I would say for everybody who's kind of lining up behind the Irish, I should say behind the Buckeyes now, and this is kind of going back to my contrarian nature, but be very careful assuming that a team that's kind of hung 40 in back-to-back games in the playoff is now going to play at that same level for a third game in a row. That is just a real huge line of demarcation. You have very few instances during the regular season where you're forced in 3 consecutive games to play opponents the caliber of Tennessee, Texas, and let's just say, either Notre Dame or Penn State. Very few teams ever have to do that for 3 consecutive games. And the idea that even the best teams could play great 3 weeks in a row doesn't happen very much. Conversely, the worst teams also don't usually play terrible 3 weeks in a row. 3 weeks is just a really interesting span of time for college football where to see consistent performance over the course of that 21-day span just infrequently happens. So my guess is for a team we've been really high on and kind of predicted their performances the last 2 weeks, you probably do see a little bit of a return to earth for Ohio State against Texas. But ultimately, that's just going to put more pressure. And I think the most interesting player in this playoff of all is Quinn Ewers. I really do. Ewers is a guy who I just think has been really unspectacular for the entirety of this year. And this is a former, one of the first really big sort of bonus baby NIL guys because he goes to Ohio State, then he comes back to Texas. This is a guy who has really been a very modern recruit in many ways. I'm not anti-Ewers. I'm not attempting to trash him. I'm just saying that if what I'm saying is true and Ohio State kind of comes back to earth, they're not hanging 40 again. This is not as dominant a performance just because they're sort of, to use a probably an improper phrase, they're just sort of due for it. If that really is the case, then that's going to put the ball in Ewers' hands with a chance to rewrite the story about him and kind of change the narrative that he really can be a special player and not just the sort of player that Texas is perhaps looking to cast aside because they're so excited about playing his backup next season. Ewers can change his story tomorrow night. My guess is he probably won't, but even if Texas does, or I should say even if Ohio State does play to a lesser standard than their last 2 games have been, Ewers probably still won't be good enough to take advantage of it. But that Ohio State-Texas game, I believe, is going to be a lot of fun. So give me Notre Dame tonight. Give me Ohio State by a small margin on Friday, and we'll do more of that then. For now, we'll make that cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let me also give a couple shots out here before we get ready to let you go. First of all, our friends at Beaver Toyota of Cumming. This is one of those weeks where, it may be a little tricky and treacherous to drive tomorrow. Well, if that's the case, that's not going to stop you from buying a great new vehicle with our friends at Beaver Toyota of Cumming, because what they're doing is they're creating a real convenient option for you to purchase your next vehicle without even having to leave your home. And it's not just convenient, it's really it's fun in many ways. We're all kind of used to shopping online. You perhaps buy your clothes that way. You may even buy your groceries that way. You can also purchase your next vehicle that way, too. Our friends at Beaver Toyota give you a chance to do that. So check them out online, beavertoyotacumming.com, beavertoyotacumming.com, because not only can you buy that vehicle, beautiful Toyota or one of the great used options they might have, not only can you buy that Toyota online, they can also deliver it to you as well. You literally never have to leave your home. So check out Beaver Toyota today, beavertoyotacumming.com. Let me also, before we say goodbye, thank our friends at Daytona Beach for being a part of the show here, too, and remind you that if you want to get some wonderful ocean breezes and some warm Florida temperatures, our friends at Daytona Beach got that for you, and it's really easy to access there as well. They got an international airport. You can fly there. You can take advantage of all the shoreline. Talk about 23 miles of shoreline right there at Daytona Beach, and I've grown up going to Daytona Beach. I love the restaurants. I love all the places to visit, the Main Street Pier, the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, obviously the International Speedway, folks know that, of course, but you want to check out the hotels, the great restaurants, and the outdoor activities, the fishing and the surfing. You can play golf. You can do all kinds of fun things. And I want you to find this today and really kind of plan your trip there, too. It'll be a lot of fun. DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals. That's DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals. Make sure you check that out today. Georgia fans still enjoying Georgia's basketball win over Kentucky earlier this week. That is the subject of our Golden Shoe today. Wyatt Fielding sharing some of those photos. Also, how about Charlie Condon there? If you're watching on video, bottom left-hand corner. Charlie Condon in Stegman Coliseum this week for the win against Kentucky. You love to see that. You love to see the happiness of the Georgia players as they celebrate with fans, and it's been a really fun thing. Of course, don't forget, as Wyatt writes in, you've also got Oklahoma coming in Saturday night at 6 p.m. He says, "Let's go! Got to have it rocking." Everybody happy about Georgia basketball right now. We'll give Wyatt Fielding a golden shoe for keeping the good vibes going on that. Lousy, stinking Gators for our Gator Hater Updater. About 1,524 days, long time since Florida has beaten Georgia. So tomorrow for our show, we'll still be here, but I'll be doing the show from home. We're going to anticipate some bad weather and try to keep everybody safe. So hopefully you're locked in and ready to go too. We will see you then, DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And on video time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs, they show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the prices promised. You can check them out today. All right, so we'll take a few comments, then we'll get ready to get out of here. And as I said before, we'll still be here for a show tomorrow, but it will be from home, just given just the nature of the weather. Although now, other than the pretty studio, the show from home is essentially functioning basically the same way the other show does, which I love. I love to do. Let's see what else. Take a few comments here. RKD says, if Caleb Downs came to Georgia, we'd still be playing right now. I don't know that I buy that. I think Caleb Downs is a really good player. I think, we got to get out of our heads that a safety, and I mean this with all due respect, is going to be as game-changing a player as the edge rushing outside linebacker, the defensive lineman, the wide receiver, the quarterback. We are just in a world in which some positions have more inherent value than others do. Caleb Downs is a really good player, and I would have obviously liked to have him for Georgia here this year, but I don't know how many seasons fortunes are going to turn on the basis of a safety. I just don't know how much of that there's going to be. Let's see what else. Jonathan Aaron says, which group in the coming season is going to take a step forward and which group is going to take a step back, in your opinion? Well, I think the one you got to be the most concerned about right now is probably outside linebacker, because, a guy like Wilson was supposed to be the face of that room, and now you're talking about, and by the way, Chaz Chambliss has gone too, and as we said earlier this week, Chambliss had a really productive season for Georgia, perhaps even more productive than he was given credit for. So I think there's that. I think the outside linebacker right now, for me, would feel like a pretty big concern. I mean, you got to be careful here because you're not mentioning everything. I also think that to go back to what I was saying before about the notion of like premium positions, Georgia needs better cornerback play. They need to be better at the cornerback position. Now, I think we're hopeful that a guy like Dalen Everett might decide to come back to Georgia and kind of stay locked in and that one starting spot. But whether it's Daniel Harris or one of the young guys kind of making a real run towards playing time, DeMello Jones or Ellis Robinson, Georgia just needs better play at the cornerback spot. That's going to be a big topic here too. And then offensively, I mean, I'm going to, I guess, make this wishful thinking, but the one that I hope steps up is just really hope the obvious answer would appear to be wide receiver because Georgia's done a lot to upgrade at that position. But boy, you hope it's an offensive line, don't you? I mean, you really hope it's offensive line because of what that might be able to provide if that's the case. Foster Moss says, aren't you excited we're going to get a fresh start at some key positions and make for a hungry batch of new dogs? I think that's a good way to look at it. I do think newcomers bring a new energy. I've always felt that way. So I think in a roundabout way, what you say could have some truth to it. I do. Let's see what else. Look at DawgNation.com. Tom says, hard to judge Bobo as an offensive coordinator if the offensive line cannot block anybody. I think some of that's really true, that I do think that some of what Bobo was asked to do this year was coach around certain things. I do think that's probably true. At the same time, while we would all acknowledge on the one hand that football is really, really complicated, really, really complicated, that there's 11 guys in the field battling 11 others, and in any given moment, diagnosing exactly what has happened in a certain play is just hard to do. I mean, it just is. But it's also sometimes easy to overcomplicate things too, that ultimately, because there's so many different intricacies and moving pieces and things that impact other things, because there's so much of that, it does sort of come back to results. And this is why I'm trying to give platform to some of the Bobo critics, because whether you did have issues at offensive line, or you had issues with injury, or a backup quarterback playing in the Sugar Bowl, whatever complicated sort of addendum you would put to the season that was, it is still a results-oriented business, and somehow, some way, results in totality probably needed to be better than they were. So, yeah, I think that's a fair point. Kent Holcomb says, when you talk about the position of safety, he just says, listen, that may be true for other safeties, but not the great former safety Terry Hogue, who, as he points out, Vince Dooley called the Rover, which was sort of a good old-school football position name. You still see some Rover in high school sometimes, but yeah, Hogue, truly one of the all-time greats. Matt Rugavina says, not to jump too far ahead, but we did see, as he points out, perfect game, which is one of the baseball rankings are weird because there are like a lot of them. Baseball is a little bit of a niche sport. Probably shouldn't be because it's pretty popular, but it just gets ignored by the mainstream whatevers. But there are a lot of top 25s in baseball. One of those is perfect game. If you have a son who plays baseball, I promise he knows perfect game. If you don't live in that world, perfect game may not be quite as important to you. But perfect game is one of those. Baseball America is another. There's a big website called D1 Baseball. They are another. So in the perfect game rankings, which I believe the first preseason rankings come out, Georgia was number 4 in those. I think they were 11th in Baseball America. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong about that, but they were 4th in perfect game. So Georgia was ranked higher from PG than Tennessee was, to give you an idea of how good this might be. So Georgia brought in a lot of transfers, and I won't pretend to be an expert on many of these guys. I'll tell you this, though. At various times, the little sort of niche accounts that do a lot of college baseball stuff, it's amazing how many of those, like, sort of niche account, people who kind of know very, very intricate things about college baseball, it's amazing how many of these Georgia transfers I've heard praised a lot. Like, there are apparently some newcomers for Georgia that have a chance to be really good. And Wes Johnson, by trade, is a pitching expert. So last year, you would say, the one thing that maybe prevented Georgia from winning the national championship was what was happening sometimes on the mound, especially later in games. That may be one of those spots where you see Johnson's expertise kind of pay immediate dividends. This may be a much better team on the mound than it was a year ago. Frank writes in at DawgNation.com to say with the big weight advantage our offensive line had over other defensive lines, I thought we would have pounded the middle a little bit more than trying the wide stuff. I think that ultimately that ends up being one of the bigger disappointments for Georgia this year is that the kind of success between the tackles, they just didn't really have it. They just didn't really have it. Now, there's always like on the one hand this, and on the other hand that part of the conversation. So on the one hand, they did not run very well between the tackles, and the offensive line probably owns a good bit of the blame for that. On the other hand, well, what if you had Roderick Robinson for a full season? That made a difference. What if you would have had Branson Robinson for a full season? Well, that made a difference. Perhaps in some cases the answer is maybe yes, but once again, the results themselves sort of are what they are, and I think that you're right about that you would have liked to have seen a little more dominance at the point of attack, a little more opening of the holes, and a little more of that component to the Georgia offense. Because, one of the things I think we'll probably end up doing tonight is we'll watch what Penn State does against Notre Dame and sort of notice things the Nittany Lions might be able to do that Georgia wasn't doing. Running game would obviously be a big part of that. Let's do a couple of Facebooks here. Matthew Dill says, if we're being honest, the Dogs were too easy to prepare for this year. even UMass had a plan and executed. We can't have that with championship expectations. Maybe. I mean, in the case of UMass, I mean, that was a bad game for Georgia defensively. I just don't think – look, I think the one thing that a lot of us have to make peace with, and this is not just true for Georgia, it may be true for everybody, is that you just simply don't get the same effort 12 times. You just don't. And it was fairly obvious that Georgia just, kind of wasn't at its best for the game against UMass. And then when they follow that up with also less than what I thought was a sort of top-shelf effort against Tech, that's when I got really concerned that this team was not going to be able to win the championship. And a lot of you were kind of getting on me a little bit for being pretty skeptical going into the Notre Dame game. If you want to know where a lot of that came from, a lot of that for me came from the Tech game. Because a week after not showing your best with a rival that had played you pretty well a year ago, and even though you had the SEC championship coming up, you still sort of needed that game. There was still, you couldn't be guaranteed you'd make the playoff if you lost the SEC championship, although in retrospect it seems like that was always destined to be the case. That wasn't guaranteed at the time. Georgia had reason to play well against Tech, and it just didn't. And so that's when I got pretty skeptical. That's when I started to think, I wonder if this is going to be a team that's able to do this here this year. And that's why I spent, a good bit of that, time leading in Notre Dame trying to give my version of a warning that just be careful here. Just be careful. All right, let's see what else. James Crump says that Notre Dame will have no answer for the Penn State tight end, Tyler Warren. Yeah, Warren's a good player, I think. But I think this Notre Dame defense is good, y'all. I mean, in this game tonight, the best unit on the field is the Notre Dame defense. I think Warren's a fine player, but the best unit on the field is Notre Dame defense. Notre Dame's defense is really good. Really good. But Warren's a good player. And had a great touchdown against Boise State. Great touchdown. I'm also sort of anti-Warren because people are trying to make him the next Brock Bowers. It's like, Bowers may be the greatest tight end of all time. The idea that there's already a year later another Brock Bowers is, once again, it's sort of an example of the kind of conventional wisdom that kind of pops up that doesn't seem to line up very well. Mike Tampa Dog mentioning Ellis Robinson. First of all, now that the portal is closed, whatever concerns I think we had about Robinson leaving, at least for now, seem to be perhaps over. Some people had kind of expressed some of that. But I also think some of this for Ellis is kind of on Ellis. He needs to step up. And, he needs to be granted an opportunity to do that. I think he probably will during the spring. But, sometimes when a young player's not playing, I think that people have a tendency to sort of think the worst of the coaches, that, these coaches are so stubborn, or these coaches aren't going to play these young guys or whatever else. I mean, it's amazing how frequently it sort of – I'm not saying Mike's doing this. I'm just using Mike's comment as a way of talking about this because I've been wanting to get to it. It's amazing to me how the condemnation of coaches comes so fast of, stubbornness, ignorance, whatever is kind of keeping a young player off the field when, perhaps there should at least be some balance there of, coaches do need to be willing to play young players, but young players also need to be capable of seizing their moment. And, maybe it's Ellis Robinson who seizes that moment, but be very careful that it's not DeMello Jones that seizes that moment, because DeMello's right there too. And listen, we saw DeMello in the state championship a couple of years ago. I thought he looked really good. So I'm as high on Ellis as I ever was, but if there's any hesitancy on his part to kind of seize the moment, someone like DeMello Jones may be the one who kind of emerges there. Don't be surprised if that happens. Jacob O'Neill also pointing out there is a brief window for the portal in April, so stuff can still happen then. That is certainly true. That is certainly true. All right, let's do one more trip around the comment section, then we're going to go. Back on YouTube for a moment. Henry Dion says about Ellis Robinson, hey, he was number one player in the country. He's sitting. He's not some average four-star. You got to get a moment to seize a moment. But here's the thing. If you don't think that and listen, I'm not anti-Ellis Robinson. I'm not down on Ellis Robinson. But if you don't think he wouldn't get 9 million reps during practice, and look, there was a point during the season where that cornerback spot was open for business, okay? There was a point in this season where there was a cornerback position for Georgia that was open. We went from Julian Humphrey playing a lot to Julian Humphrey not playing at all. There was a opportunity for somebody to take it, and Daniel Harris is the one that took it. So we may not have seen Ellis playing very much, but that doesn't mean they weren't watching Ellis closely, looking for signs that he was ready to play. Like, practice is where this happens. Practice is where this happens. And I think we're led to believe that that didn't happen. And I'm not down on Ellis. I think that Ellis may go on to have a great career at Georgia. Probably will based on what the ratings would suggest to you here. But as of now, Ellis Robinson is not the only cornerback that I'm interested in. I'm also very interested in DeMello Jones, too. Andrew Hughes asked about Sam Pittman. So Pittman is coming back in 2025, I believe. I don't believe that Sam Pittman is ever going to be an offensive line coach again. I think that Pittman's going to be a head coach for as much longer as that goes. Then after that, he's going to go sit by the lake. He's going to go sit by the lake after that, if I had to guess. All right, let's see what else. Let's get a couple more. A lot of good YouTube comments. I'm trying to get to them all. Let's see what else. James Richard says Kirby's tough to work for. I mean, I think that Pittman enjoyed working for Kirby. I do. Now, I think that, Kirby's one of these guys. You have to be sort of built a certain way to be able to do it. I think that Pittman was. I think he made the Georgia staff better while he was here. I also think he's done with that. I think he's paid his dues as an offensive line coach, and the sort of grind of portal being open and draft declarations and, writing letters to 2027s or whatever else. I think that, when Pittman's time as the head coach is done, he's going to go bet some horses and sit by the lake and do that kind of deal. B.A. Scardigan on the subject of Daniel Harris. I mean, look, Harris's body type I really like. Long arms, good frame. I really like it. It probably did not at times this year add up to what I hoped that it would, and Georgia does need to be better at that, just at the cornerback spot in general going forward. Yeah, Stacy Bloom points out something really good. Stacy, this is a really good point. That in the case of like freshmen playing early, the idea that Ellis was sort of artificially kept down, that wasn't true for KJ Bolden. KJ Bolden kind of had his spot right away, at least a playing spot right away, and kind of made good with that. I mean, Kirby sort of always said that if you're good enough, you're old enough. And in the case of Bolden, he kind of proves that. So, I think that we have to give the benefit of the doubt here. There wasn't some sort of like conspiracy against playing Ellis Robinson. He just wasn't ready. Just wasn't ready, apparently. And I don't do a lot of the like, I know something you don't know type stuff, but in talking to people who know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, I never got the impression that Robinson was likely to leave anyway. Like, people sort of assume that cornerback being the position where it's, just for lack of a better way of saying this, people think of cornerback as being a diva-ish position, and a five-star cornerback must be like a real big diva. Otherwise, people just sort of assume that. But I never got the impression, based on who I talked to, and gosh knows, maybe the people I talked to were wrong, I never got the impression that Ellis Robinson was unhappy. I really didn't. But you never know, I guess. Lance D says the KJ situation was different than the Ellis Robinson situation. I mean, kind of, but you still had Dan Jackson, and you still had Janelle Aguero at the star. I mean, mean, both guys faced competition. Just in the one case, Bolden seemed to at least hold his own in that competition well enough that you had to have him on the field. But once again, I am not anti-Ellis Robinson. Ellis Robinson may win the Thorpe Award this year, for all I know. He might do it. Foster Moss pointing out that not everybody's Derek Stingley. And this is actually a really good point from Foster. Y'all watch this tonight and tomorrow. Look how few freshmen are playing for anybody. Like, how many freshmen are playing? I mean, other than Jeremiah Smith, of course. But, I mean, how many freshmen are playing for Ohio State? How many freshmen are going to be playing this game tonight? Like, it's really hard to play as a freshman. It is. It is. I mean, hard to play as a freshman. And you're going to have a Jeremiah Smith. You're going to have a Ryan Williams. Y'all may have heard he's only 17 years old. You're going to have a guy like this. Years ago, you'll have a Derek Stingley. You're going to have just enough to show you what's possible for a freshman. But what we don't see is, like, the preponderance of evidence that suggests that there are just not a lot of freshmen lighting the world on fire. They're just not. That's just the way it goes. Let's see what else. Kenneth Holt on the subject of Oscar Delp and Lawson Lucky for next year. Yeah, Oscar's one of those NFL draft declarations that we're still waiting for. I mean, I always hate to say that I'm hoping he stays because, not to say I don't want these guys to go make big money in the NFL if they have a chance to do it, but selfishly, I'd love for Oscar Delp to come back. I really would. Jonathan Aaron said that Kirby said some nice things about Robinson in New Orleans. Yeah, I think that he did. I do think that he's probably growing into his role. I have a suspicion they probably would have liked it had he kind of stepped in and kind of taken somebody's spot here this year. I think there was certainly a chance to do it. But I don't think they're down on Ellis Robinson. I do not. I do not think they're down on Robinson. Charles Dalton says he watched Ethan Barbour. He thinks he's the truth. Yeah, I think of all the recruits that Georgia's bringing in, I believe that Barbour might be the most underrated. He's a really good kind of playmaking tight end. Played mostly wide receiver this past year for Milton. He's a really good playmaking type guy. All right, let me give you a couple other comments. Ready to go. Let's see. Back on Facebook for a moment. Jimmy Gibbs says, hey, not many Champ Bailey's, Travis Hunters. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a small, group of special players for sure. Alan Verbanchik says, how about them Hoop Dogs? Yes, Saturday against Oklahoma. That's a big game for Georgia because they're all big here moving forward. Brian Whitaker, thanks for the kind words. Appreciate that. James Crump speaking some truth here, saying that Penn State tight end's not as close to being as good as Brock Bowers, but he is very good. We'll see if Penn State's offensive coordinator is going to have to take advantage of that. Yeah, it's a pretty good matchup. I mean, I do have respect for the Notre Dame defense. I had respect for that defense going into the Georgia game. I think it's a pretty good group. I do. I think that Notre Dame defense is a pretty good group. But Warren's certainly a big player. Jason Wood says in the sort of diagnosis of coaches here, why are we not looking at the wide receiver coach? Well, once again, as a fan, just like y'all are, I am very pro James Coley right now. Receivers drop passes left and right. I honestly don't know how much of that you can coach. I mean, but Coley is a massive talent acquisition guru right now. Major portal, arrivals, big-time recruiting class. I mean, of the assistant coaches for Georgia, I would give the sort of highest favorable rankings to. Coley's pretty high on my list. Todd Hartley sort of forever stays up there for me. Coley's pretty high right now. I know people are sort of down on the offense in general, and goodness knows they led the nation in drops. But as weird as it sounds, I'm going to value his ability to bring in talent more because, I mean, it's happening at a much higher clip now than it was before he got here. So I'm pretty pro Coley at the moment. Sebastian Clerk also mentioning Hines Ward. Hines Ward's at Arizona State. He's obviously putting together a coaching resume. But as I said, I like Hines. I think it'd be fun to have a guy like that here. He is clear. I mean, he told me once that he wanted to be here. And he's clearly made it very clear that he'd like to coach Georgia. He's been very clear about that. But right now, I am happy with the wide receivers coach that Georgia has. I think that James Coley, I mean, he just nailed two massive transfers, a five-star receiver, which Georgia hadn't signed since 2019. I mean, this is maybe the best group of high school receivers they've ever signed. And they got two nice transfers coming in on top of it. Matt Rukavina says he's pulling for Notre Dame. I guess I am too. Boy, and to think that, I mean, years ago, that would have been a statement for me that would have been a pretty good indication that I've been taken hostage and that I've been abducted by aliens or something like that. I can't imagine a world previously in which I'd root for Notre Dame, but given the alternative, I guess you almost have to. Yard Dog asking about Dalen Everett. I have not heard that yet. Keep in mind, while the portal for entrance has closed, the draft declaration thing goes on for a while. So some of this stuff may stretch on for a while. UGA Marine says that drops can be like the yips if you ever play golf or something like that. Yeah, I guess a little bit. I also think that some guys are just more prone to drops. I mean, you can teach a guy to be a little bit more of a hands catcher, get the hands out a little bit more, and not go to the chest. You can try to do that, but I mean, I hate to be this way, but if you go look at every player in college that has a significant drop issue, that's also targeted a pretty good bit. If you go back and read the high school scouting report, my guess is that probably also showed up on that too. That there are some guys you just sort of take the flyer on because the athleticism says that you should, but drops are a hard thing to shake off. And in some cases for Georgia this year, it's like you'll see a guy who does the hard thing of actually getting open because given the choice of what's more difficult, catching the football or getting open on the field, it's way more difficult to get open than it is to catch the ball. And that's what's so frustrating about some of the Georgia drops is that the player in question will have created some space for himself on a football field. I got a terrible ringing in my ears. Will have created some space for himself. There you go. That fixed that. Create some space for himself to get open, but then the easier part of it, which is catching the football, not doing that. So that's a little bit frustrating. Anyway, we got to go. Anything else? Baruch Dog, addressing some of those drops too. I mean, there's no doubt that Georgia has made a concerted effort to upgrade its receiver position. We will see if it works, and we will see how much the production changes because of that. But an issue that Georgia fans say they've noticed, Georgia itself, I think, is indicating to you they've noticed too, and they're, pretty aggressive about trying to address that right now, you would certainly think. Let us see what else. All right, we got to go. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that today. Tomorrow we'll be back live. We'll be enjoying a nice, comfortable heating system in our house. We're not going to come into the studio because of the weather and stuff like that. So if your home heating system isn't as comfortable as mine is, then our friends at RS Andrews can help you out with that. You can find them online, rsandrews.com. Get that old system tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Or if you need to replace it, they can do that for you. But they might be able to show you how to get some new life out of that old unit, and it may only cost you $99. So try them out today on all of that. I will see you from the friendly confines of my own home tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. We'll look forward to talking to you then.